This is Philip Crosby, and I'm still in Alaska. As you notice, there is no barber here and no hair products or anything else, so my hair is all aloof and my beard has not been cut since I left. My kids are actually having fun with this. It's kind of like COVID beard again, so we're gonna play with that. As we wrap up class, this is our last week, kind of going through of lecture. Next week is final weeks, and so make sure as we kind of walk through. Kind of getting into next week, there's a couple things that you need to keep in mind. The first one is next week is finals week, and so on finals week, you do not go to all of your classes like normal. You will only go to your assigned final at any one point in time. So this week will be our last week that you'll have standard scheduling on campus at Central Texas College. Our final is obviously going to be online, and so what I will do is I will release it. Our final for our class is going to be none other than the last two biweekly assessments. So our quote-unquote final exam is simply our biweekly 7 and 8 combined. And so we're going to see this kind of combined element. So it's going to be a little bit longer, which justifies the final element, but you're not going to have any new assignments coming at you in that final week. So it is a combined assessment. Same rules apply. It's going to have questions off of biweekly 1 through biweekly 6. So make sure in preparation, whatnot, you kind of looked at everything we've covered in class and looked at those old assessments. Also, as we're coming down the pipeline, make sure you've looked at your chosen route and you've completed the work required for your chosen route. So biweekly assessments are minimum. The supplemental reading are a minimum as well. For those of y'all who are on the B route, make sure you get the data activities in. And for those of y'all that are on the A route, you'll actually need to work with me over the next week or so to schedule a time during finals week that we can get up or that we can connect. Usually what I'll do is I'll use a Google Meet to a location that you decide. I'll send you a link and we'll have a conversation about something we covered in class. Everything is fair game in those conferences. It really is a live conference to measure the amount of information kind of gleaned from the course. And so for those in the A route, make sure you've kind of communicated with me, sent me a message, and make sure we're working to set up a thing. I'm pretty sure that we can set up during your normal class period. So if you're in my 9 o'clock class, we can get that during the 9 o'clock class. If you're in my 10:30 class, same thing. We can set that up at the 10:30 time. So just make sure you're communicating with me and we'll get that knocked out. And so make sure final exam is coming. All the other information is already there. So as we come down the wire, make sure you're getting the stuff necessary in. This last week, we're going to briefly touch on the Supreme Court of the United States. This is something that a lot of people are completely... not sure the right word is. I've tried to define this over the years, and I'm not sure what the right word is, but of all the branches of the United States government, I think people get the Supreme Court the most wrong. And everything that we do, we have a general conceptual understanding of legislative power. We kind of vaguely misunderstand what the president does and even more how he's selected. But when it comes to judiciary, we really do mess up the construct of what it means to have a judicial department that is charged with a judicial power. And one of the biggest reasons for this is because we so often equip judicial power with the concept of justice. And that is a mistake. Do not do that. The concept of justice is abstract and turns on the relative definition that one concocts to base a systemic fairness upon. And so when you get into the elements of justice, that is varied, quite varied, depending on who you ask, where you're going, and what systems you may imply. So on one side of this, we can say, well, we're supposed to have this concept of justice, and the Supreme Court is supposed to enact justice. And that's just not the case. Like I said, justice is going to turn on whatever system of fairness you have developed over your course of history. And literally, nation by nation, person by person is going to turn on what they mean by justice. And even in America, we do not have any kind of uniform understanding of the concept of justice. And overwhelmingly, our conception of justice really it comes down to a component of revenge. There's so much about the American component of justice that when we argue justice, we're really arguing some type of retaliation, some type of eye for an eye, which is an ancient form of justice, but it's not this kind of fairness, equality, and sound reason that we want to pride ourselves on today. And so we need to be very, very cautious not to put this kind of idea of justice onto the judicial power, because if we do, then we're always going to be mistaken on what the Supreme Court can do. If we believe we can just stack the Supreme Court with 9 individuals that can magically craft a society of justice, then we've created a pie in the sky kind of idea that they're never going to satisfy. And that's a problem, because at the basis of our entire governing institution rests judicial power, the ability of the institution to function as it was designed to function without a lot of wavering elements along the way. In other words, the judicial power is intended to steady the ship of state by guaranteeing that the design comes through in the manifestation, to guarantee that what the people did empower the government with actually is the power the government has. And so when we start looking at judicial power, we have to separate judicial power from this construction of the judicial branch. And this is something that from the fort we have to separate. So we're not going to have a conversation of justice. I give lectures on justice. It's a big political theory. I love the concept of justice. If you want to have a great book on justice, Michael Sandel wrote a book on justice called Who's Right is Right Anyway, and it's a brilliant read on just how many ways we can splice justice out. But here in this class, we're looking at judicial power. And if we're looking at judicial power, we're looking at a Supreme Court of the United States, or as we often put, SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States. And this Supreme Court is going to have 9 individuals that mitigate conflicts as they arise within the people underneath the governing structure. And so within every collective society, you're going to have people run into each other for a vast number of reasons. We're going to run into each other as individuals. We're going to run into each other as organizations versus individuals. And some of us are going to run into the government. That's just the way it works. Because of the complications of large society, there are going to be times where we run into each other. And when we do, the idea of the modern conception of judicial power is that there is an advocacy, there is a place we can go to be heard and have our plight mitigated. So we don't have to go on this kind of antiquated eye for an eye, they hurt me, so I hurt them, so they hurt me back, so I hurt them back. And we kind of have this conception of violence that reciprocates and destroys society. In order to prevent that reciprocal digress of society into violence, we have this new judicial power. And the judicial power is designed to mitigate conflict. That is the goal. That is what they do. How do we build something that if I have conflict, we can resolve that conflict without resorting to methods of war? And that's what the judicial power, the judicial function is trying to do. Now, a couple things before we start. Number one, we currently have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. We don't have to have 9. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires 9. That number is set by law. And yes, individual presidents that have wanted to use the Supreme Court for their own nefarious purposes have challenged that. Most notably, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his court packing scheme challenged the 9, trying to increase the Supreme Court so they would do what he wanted them to do instead of what they were designed to do. Joe Biden, when he first took president, he also looked into adding justices to the court, but quickly kind of stepped away from that as it was overwhelmingly perceived negatively by the American people, and rightfully so. The American Supreme Court is the last vestige of decency and integrity our system has. Should it fall, I think we're looking at a complicated mess when we get into this. And so I was glad to see Joe Biden step away from that, but I was discouraged to see him even propose it at all. The Supreme Court has become a far cry from what it was intended to be. And so if we're going to move forward and look at what the Supreme Court was intended to be and what it should be, then we have to go back and look at what is the judicial power. So we have 9 people sitting in the court. It stays 9. The other big thing about just the setup of the court is established by appointments of the president. So the president gets to appoint anybody he wants to sit as a Supreme Court justice. Those sitting appointments then have to go to the Senate for confirmation. So when we look at this kind of element, right, it begins with the President of the United States, and the President of the United States gets to appoint a Supreme Court justice. They have to be confirmed by the Senate. So the Senate goes through a confirmation hearing. And if they get through the confirmation hearing, which can be very divisive, they do win an appointment for life so long as they have good behavior. So they can be removed via impeachment, but generally speaking, we're looking at a lifetime appointment. So this is a big deal. And a lot of people are like, why? Why do we have life appointments? Why the presidential appoint? Now, once again, something we've already covered in class. Remember, the President of the United States was supposed to be the most honorable individual we could find. And the Electoral College was supposed to guarantee that the honor intended in the presidency remained intact. So you can begin seeing this, like if you look at this from the presidency today, that's a very partisan position, a very kind of I lead the Republicans or Democrats first, and this really doesn't make a lot of sense. And I would argue that in the iteration of today, no, this doesn't make a lot of sense. However, from a constitutional perspective, if the Electoral College does its job and achieves the most honorable individual as president, then yes, this does make sense. This would mean that the most honorable individual we can find now is able to select members to guarantee a resolution of all conflict. Because if your judges do this, if your judges are intended to resolve conflict, now we have a very narrow understanding, a very narrow experience that's really needed to accomplish that function. If our justices are simply partisan hacks that are over here to establish some, ambiguous conception of justice, then anybody can throw anybody on the Supreme Court and want any decision out of it. And that's a slippery slope of epic proportions, which we're currently sliding quickly down. And so what we need to do is we need to establish what the judicial power is, and then maybe moving forward as a generation, we can begin fixing it. So without further ado, let's look at what they are. Like we've done everywhere else in this class, we need to start with the Constitution, with the intention of the Constitution. And so when we look at this, we're going to look at Federalist 78. In Federalist 78, right, Alexander Hamilton is going to lay out bare the intention of the Supreme Court and the type of person that should occupy the position. And if you read this and stay with me, you are going to get a different version of the Supreme Court than what we see today, and I would argue a better version of the Supreme Court. So if we were going to fix not just the Supreme Court, but if we're going to fix the United States government, I think it is incredibly essential that we have this conversation and begin to stabilize the court once again. So Federalist 68, the idea is this, right? Remember, the people of the United States sets up the House, the people of the United States set up the state legislature and the Electoral College. Now, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to separate this idea of how much say the people should have in this construction of federal government. Remember, the people were given a direct line to the House of Representatives, but they were barred from both the presidency and the Senate. Notice that there is not going to be any direct connection between the people and the Supreme Court of the United States. Why? Because we wanted to prevent conceptions of kangaroo courts, right? People are really, 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 really bad about determining justice. We are bad about it on one-on-one relationships and our marriages and our couples therapy, right? We are bad about it with our kids, right? We're just not good. We get emotional, we get tied in, we get angry, we get upset, and logic and reason go out the window. And so of all the things that the Founding Fathers gave the people power to establish, they did not give the people power over this arena of government, right? And so, like I said, you had secondary powers that would then guarantee an integrity of the Senate, right? And this was done by the state legislatures. The Electoral College was stamped between the people and the presidency, but again, no connection whatsoever between the people and the Supreme Court. And so what happens is we then take the Supreme Court and we let the presidency appoint the Supreme Court here. And notice that the presidency is 2 steps removed from the people, now 3 steps removed, and the Supreme Court is affirmed not by the House of Representatives, which is directly connected to the people, but by the Senate, which is reserved and removed from the people. So, in other words, the original design set the court the furthest away from public say, from public influence. In other words, no, we should not get to elect the Supreme Court members. We should not get elected justices, and any president who argues that the Supreme Court is on the ballot is already violating any noble intention of the Constitution. I'm looking at almost every single president of the last 40 years, right? The Supreme Court is supposed to sit outside of public opinion, not inside of it. And so, as we look at this, what have we seen historically? Stuff we've already done. The 17th Amendment is going to reduce the distance between the Senate and the people, the Electoral College using political primaries and whatnot, the winner-take-all system, stuff we've already discussed ad nauseum in Unit 3. They are going to, reduce the distance between the presidency and the people. All of this bringing the Supreme Court closer and closer and closer to the hands of the people. And remember, if the parties control the people, then the party, through popular control, can now easily take over the House, which we saw, right? The 17th Amendment gives them the Senate. Political primaries and winner-take-all give them. So what is the last thing, the last grand prize that the two parties want to achieve, right? It is not by accident that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, after taking control of the 2 other branches, set his sight on the 3rd one, right? This is not by accident. Remember Thanos. Remember the separation of powers. Remember the zeal of powerful individuals wanting to consume all power unto themselves, right? It is not by accident that we see the Supreme Court in the midst of huge political controversy, and it's not going away anytime soon. So let's look at the Founding Fathers and what they said. We proceed now to the examination of the Judiciary Department of the proposed government. The manner of constitution seems to embrace these several objects. First, the mode of appointing judges. In other words, how we appoint judges is an issue, right? Some people are having an issue on the president appoints, right? That's an issue. We're going to unpack it. The second thing is the tenure. Lifetime appointments were an issue. Should they get lifetime? Of all the things we gave this new government, this is by far the longest appointment that we would have. Why did we give Supreme Court justices lifetime appointments? And the third one, the partition of the judiciary authority between different courts and their relations to each other. We're not going to dive in that third one, but we're going to take on the first 2 and look at what their intention is with the other 2 branches, though. Right? So we move on. Hamilton argues, whoever attentively considers the different departments of power must perceive that in a government in which they are separated from each other, the judiciary, from the nature of its function, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution. Number one, we need to wrap our heads around this. In a government which are separate from each other, so if we're looking at a government where the 3 powers are separated from each other, having an executive power, a legislative power, and a judiciary, then the judiciary, right, from the nature of its function, by its very design, the judiciary is always going to be the least dangerous to the political rights of the people. Right? In other words, you should fear the Supreme Court the least. The Supreme Court should never dynamically engage in your existence much at all. Right? At all. Right? You should never sit back and bite your fingernails worrying about what the Supreme Court decision is going to be on any given case. Right? They should always be the least dangerous, the most dull, the most boring. Right? This is not a branch of government that should capture the headlines of the New York Times. Right? Why? Because it will be in least incapacity to annoy or injure them. Then he goes on to why. He says the executive, right, talking about the presidency of the United States, the executive, right, not only dispenses the honors, but holds the sword of the community. In other words, the executive is going to be your cops, your police, your FBI, your IRS, right? They can literally sometimes break down your door and infringe on your rights as they carry out their duty, right? So the executive is going to have a direct power, direct possibility of really infringing on your day-to-day existence. He also says the legislature
legislature not only commands the purse, but prescribes the rules and duties by which every citizens are to be regulated. And so the legislature is also going to dramatically impact your life because they literally set what is and what is not allowed within your given society. And so the legislature, by extension of what they do, is going to prescribe what the executive carries out. And so both of the executive and legislative powers can dynamically engage in your existence, right? He says the judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence over sword nor the purse, no direction of strength or of wealth of society, and can take no active resolution whatever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgment. This is one of my favorite lines of all Federalist number 78. It says, it may truly be said to have neither force nor will. In other words, if the Supreme Court was doing what the Supreme Court was designed to do, then it would not have either force nor will. Right? In other words, it wouldn't matter what the individual justices thought on their individual thing. It wouldn't matter what they thought justice should be. Those conceptions of individuality don't matter because the Supreme Court justices do not have any such will that they act upon, and they have no force in society. So if they don't have force and they don't have will, what exactly do? They judge. They judge. They sit and they judge. They guarantee a fair hearing. They guarantee the right to be heard. They guarantee that all parties in conflict have a resolution that does not digress into violence, right? They are the rational, sensible, better minds that come to the forefront and allow us to, exasperate our frustration, our emotions, our feelings of wrong within a civilized manner. They judge, and by settling the judgment, they allow for a fair settlement. Okay? The simple view of the matter suggests several important consequences. It proves incontestably that the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power, that it can never attack with success either of the other two, and that all possible care is requisite to enable it to defend itself against their attacks. Once again, taking on this notion that we have three equal branches of government. Again, poppycock. It proves incontestably, right? Incontestably that the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three, right? So if the judiciary is the weakest of the three, it is most at risk, right, to be taken over by the other two branches of power, right? And so we have to kind of conceptualize this and look at, right, how do we actually see the justice? What is their design? And what is the risk of them being taken over? Because they are the weakest of the other two branches. And I think this is overwhelmingly important to understand, and we don't have time to get into it in class, but this is why John Marshall is so critically important to the United States Supreme Court, and why Marbury versus Madison is so critically important as well. Because in Marbury versus Madison, when the two competing political parties, really led by Adams and Jefferson, right, tried to take advantage of the court, it was John Marshall sitting in the court in 1805 that said, no, I will not allow the court to be used by political influence. I will not allow the court to be a lapdog of partisan influence. And Marshall gave the court an integrity, so to speak, an ability to kind of set beyond partisan divides and to be trusted to resolve the conflicts as they emerge. When the court has functioned well and they were able to have this respect, this integrity, we have managed as a society. When the court lost its respect, when the court lost its integrity, right? Look at Dred Scott. The Dred Scott case leading into the Civil War is a great example of that. And so when we start looking at the court losing its respect, losing its integrity, then we lose the ability to settle conflict reasonably, and bad things happen. So when we start looking at this, the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest, and so it really kind of puts the impetus on the judges themselves, that when they become judges, they have to act in such a way not to be perceived as partisan. I think John Marshall does this brilliantly well. I think John Roberts currently doing this. Neil Gorsuch is another one I think is doing this brilliantly well. The other justices sitting on the Supreme Court, those are the only two that I think are really managing themselves within this. The other ones have given into his large partisan, which is why John Roberts has such a difficult narrative on his hands, or such a difficult issue on his hand, because not only is John Roberts trying to settle the disputes that arise in our society, he's trying to settle those very same disputes on his own Supreme Court. And so this becomes an issue, and we're going to see this play out over the coming years. But that's a different lecture for a different day. So we go on here. The Federalist 78 says the complete independence of the courts of justice is peculiarly essential in a limited constitution. So what do we really need more than anything else? We need more than anything else the complete independence of the courts, right? Not partial independence, right? The courts must be isolated and separated from the other two, right? It is essential in a limited constitution. Why? What do we mean by a limited constitution? I understand one of which contains certain specified exemption to the legislative authority. And so when I give this separation of powers, right, I have the legislative branch, which gets to make law, right? I have the executive branch, which gets to carry out the law and make safe the castle, right? We already talked about this ad nauseum. Right, and so the judiciary branch, what do they get to do? They don't get to make law. They don't get to carry out law. But what Hamilton is saying there is if we confine these two to a limited constitution, a limited government, right? If we confined it to those, then what guarantees that the lawmakers and the executives stay within the limitations prescribed by the people consenting to the government? Right? So if our government is a government by consent, then the people by consent allow the government certain power. So this government here is going to be given certain powers. But what happens if the lawmakers try to step out of that power? What happens if the president tries to step out of that allotted power? What happens if the government violates the consent of the people and steps beyond their allowed role? Remember, the Supreme Court's primary obligation is to settle conflict. Therefore, if you understand the Supreme Court right, then the persons that should be most fearful of a Supreme Court decision is not you, the people. It is those in power seeking to gain more power than the Constitution allows. That's who is bothered by the Supreme Court. Those are the ones that want to take over the Supreme Court and pack the Supreme Court with individuals that will willingly allow them to step beyond the constitutional allowances and to do things that the people have not consented for them to do. Right? This is overwhelmingly important. It explains what's happened to the court, explains the history of the court, it explains why FDR so zealously attacked the court, right? Everything comes into view when you understand what the court's primary role and function is. By a limited constitution, I understand one of which contains certain specified exemptions to legislative authority. Limitations of this kind can be preserved in practice no other way than through the medium of the courts of justice, right? So what do? We set up the courts to keep the lawmakers in their lane. We set up the courts to keep the presidents in check, right? Why? Whose duty it must be to declare all acts contrary to the manifest tenor of the Constitution void. Without this, all reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing. Without somebody guaranteeing your rights, guaranteeing this limitation, then all of the rights and privileges that you think you have, that you thought you were guaranteed, every ounce of power that you thought you gave the government is null and void, right? Without the courts maintaining a protection of what the government can and can't do, then the government can effectively do whatever the hell they want to, and you have no security or protection. So perplexities, reflecting the rights of the court to pronounce the legislative acts void. because contrary to the Constitution has risen from the imagination that the doctrine implies superiority of the judiciary to the legislative power. It is urged that the authority which can declare the acts of another void must necessarily be superior to the ones whose acts may be declared void. As this doctrine is of great importance in all American constitutions, a brief discussion on the ground which rests cannot be unacceptable. Now, Hamilton liked his words, and he is known to be somewhat verbose. I have been accused of the same thing. But what is he saying here? He's saying that, well, if the judges here can essentially check the president and check the legislature, doesn't this mean that the judges are more powerful than either the legislatures or the executive? And if they're more powerful, how can you argue that they're least powerful? And so Hamilton is saying, yeah, there's some complexities here, and he makes some jabs about lesser minds not understanding this, but he's essentially going to stick to his point and say, no, that by checking these powers, the judges aren't enacting any new power. It becomes a difference between a positive power and a negative power, right? A positive power is the power to create, right? A legislature can create law. It can create new things and new limitations in our society within the allowance of the Constitution. The president can create ways to execute that law. He can use executive discretion to carry out things, right? However, the judges don't get to create things. They simply get to say, did somebody step out of line? Yes or no? Was a harm caused? Yes or no? And does reconciliation need to happen? Yes or no? And so this is kind of one like a, we look at this and we're like, that's not really a power, so to speak. They just kind of like make sure the game's played the right way. If you've ever seen the NFL is a great way to understand this. If you look at the day-to-day NFL. The NFL has all three powers. And for those of you who aren't football fans, I apologize for this example, but nonetheless, the NFL is going to have a lawmaking branch, right? This is where they create the rules of the play. What are the rules of the game, whatnot? And this happens before this game ever to play. This does not happen in real time. They're not going into the Cowboys game and trying to figure out what a catch is. That's not in real time. What a catch is was already written in the law book at some kind of legislative assembly, rulemaking assembly, and rulemaking process the NFL has. Now, during game time, the actual execution of those rules is carried out by the refs, right? The referees, we often think are the judges. They're not. Just like we think that cops are stewards of justice. They're not, right? Cops are members of the executive. You're going to run into cops. You're going to have conflict with the cops. The cops are not here to guarantee and ensure justice. They're not, right? We use a lot of terminology that confuses everyone. We need to square this away, right? The cops are executioners. They're going to execute the laws. They're going to guarantee that the laws are carried out and have integrity. Right? But that means that in the quick-paced action of the law, they're not always going to get everything right? They're just not. They're going to have some bad calls, and we have cops that make bad calls a lot. This is why, right, historically speaking, we just had these two branches of government, and there was a conflict that remained, right? With these two branches alone, we didn't have adequate conflict resolution to really guide us away from this conflict, so we needed something else. And in the modern iteration of separation of powers, we needed something else to kind of separate this. And this is where you get into the judicial power. And the judicial power is going to be this branch, the third one, all right? How do I actually understand whether or not a execution of the law was intact with the law itself? How do I guarantee that the game was played fairly? All right, guys, you may play Monopoly and you may hate the rules, all right? I get it. You hate the rules. You don't like it, right? Toss out Monopoly, play your own game, right? But the reality is the rules are still the rules because thousands upon thousands of people, the history of the United States has played the game of Monopoly, and what unifies the game of Monopoly is we play by the certain sense of rules that hold us together, right? So if you start throwing out all the rules all at once and you're no longer playing Monopoly, you're playing some, half-created game at your house, right? If you want to play the same game, then you're looking at fairness of play, and fairness of play means consistency of the rules, which means there's got to be something guaranteeing those consistency for the game to have integrity. And so the judicial branch comes in, and this is going to be your review officials. Right? So when there's a conflict, a ref throws a flag or didn't call a flag, or there was an issue on the field that wasn't called right, a coach can throw a red flag, a booth review can come and say, hey, wait, we need to slow this down, right? We need to take a break. We need to stop the game. We need to make sure that in this circumstance, the rules were applied the right way. Notice that in the catch or in the NFL, we're not trying to rewrite the rules, right? That's not what we're trying to do. The Supreme Court is not there to rewrite the rules or to make up new rules. The Supreme Court is there to say, okay, what happened? Go to the rule book and then say, okay, this is what the rule book says, and this is how it has been applied in the past. Therefore, to remain consistent and fair, this is the right answer to this question, and they move on, right? They move on, right? In other words, they don't enact any new great power. All they do is say, slow it down. Let's talk about this. Let's figure this out. Settle down. What does the rule book say? And they apply it. Well, in a society, what is a rule book? The rule book is the Constitution. So what happens if the president does something in real time? What happens if lawmakers do something in real time? What happens if a state governor cop does something in real time? Right? What happens if it hurts you? Then you have an institution, you have an organization that said, okay, let's slow it down. Let's look at the evidence. Let's look at video replay. Let's look at what we have. Let's make sure that the rules were applied. What if you don't like the rules? What if you think the rules are unfair? Guys, that's not for the judges to decide. Rules are made by the legislative power, not the judicial power. Right? So if you don't like the rules, that's not an issue for the Supreme Court. That's an issue for either a constitutional amendment, which has to be done by the people, right? Or an issue for the legislature to change a rule that they've made. Right? So if I'm looking at a we won't get there, right? We're not going to go there. So essentially, when we're looking at rules, right? Take the gay marriage thing. Gay marriage thing came up, and they're like, well, we want the Supreme Court to change the rule. Guys, it wasn't the Supreme Court that passed the Defense of Marriage Act in the 1990s, right? That was the lawmakers, right? They passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which they defined marriage at that point, and a lot of tax benefits were based on that definition of marriage. And so when the homosexual lobby said, we want the rule changed, they took it to the court, right? Guys, the question is, right, number one, does the Constitution allow the government of the United States to define marriage? Number one, that should have been, is that in the rules? Is that part of Monopoly game, right? If it does, then yeah, they could have defined it however they want to. If they don't, right, then they can't define it, and they throw all definitions of marriage out the window. That's what the court should have done. They didn't, because the court got political over the last 50 years. And here's the reality. Even though the court ruled on gay marriage, the issue is as complicated and as tenuous today as it was when it was passed a couple years ago, right? Abortion was passed in 1973. It's as contentious today as it was 50 years ago. The court hasn't resolved much in the last 50 years. Why? Because they've given way to partisan institutions, and they've started trying to get involved in the rulemaking game. They're not supposed to be there. They're supposed to simply look at the rules that are made and apply them, right? So we look at this, right, of looking at judges kind of like the bulwarks of the rules. He says, if then the courts of justice are to be considered as bulwarks of a limited constitution against legislative encroachments, this consideration will afford a strong argument for the permanent tenures of judicial offices, since nothing will contribute so much as to this independent spirit of the judges, which must be essential to their faithful performance of so arduous a duty. In other words, why do judges get lifetime appointments? Judges get lifetime appointments so they will not fall to the wanton wishes of public opinion, which seems to shift every other year, right? If you want something to remain consistent, you have to have a body wrapped in integrity and longevity, able to be consistent over time and not suffer the somewhat wanton backlashes of the people when they make an unpopular decision. Because if the courts of justice are doing their job right, they're going to make unpopular decisions. right? That's what the court is supposed to do. They're supposed to sit there. So what should a Supreme Court member be? A Supreme Court member should be the most boring individual in society, right? Hamilton says, there is yet a further and weightier reason for the permanency of the judicial offices, which is deducible from the nature of the qualifications they require. It has been frequently remarked with great propriety that a voluminous code of law is one of the inconveniences necessarily connected with the advantages of free government. In other words, if you give people freedom, they're going to run into each other a lot, and you're going to have somebody willing to go and study all of that running into each other, right? And if you do that, somebody's going to have to go to law school and memorize a whole host of law. To avoid an arbitrary discussion of the courts, notice, what are we trying to avoid? A personal, individual, arbitrary discretion. We don't want judges acting on their whim of their opinion of what they want, right? It is indispensable they should be bound down by strict rules and precedents. When people ask me, what should your Supreme Court judges look like? That is it. A Supreme Court judge should be bound down. They do not give their opinion. They give what is the historic application of this law, of this regulation. They don't sit there and invoke themselves, right? A Supreme Court judge should never have the audacity to tell us what they personally think. That is beyond the limitations of the court, that is beyond the limitations of a free government, and that is beyond the integrity of the seat upon which they sit. That is not their job. Their job is to research exhaustively the history of law application in the United States and to guarantee continual consistency in the application of the law, so that this game that we continue to play called government, is done fairly and consistently, and we can understand the rules. That's the point, which serve to define any point of duty every particular case comes before them, and it will readily be conceived from the variety of controversies which grow out of the folly and wickedness of mankind, that the records of those precedents, all the times that we have run into each other, must unavoidably swell to a very considerable bulk, and must demand long and laborious study to acquire competent knowledge of them. Hence it is that there can be but few men in society who will have sufficient skill in the laws to qualify them for the stations of judges. Why do we have lifetime appointments? Number one, so that these individuals don't fall to the pressures of public opinion. But the other thing is because it's going to be really hard to find anybody qualified for this type of task. This should be the most boring individual we can find. They sit in libraries and they read books. And when they're asked a question, they're like, well, back in 1931, there was this issue, blah, blah, blah. And we're like, oh, dear God, shut up. That's your judge. That's it. That's what we want them to be. That's what the Supreme Court is supposed to be. Right? Now, when we start looking at this, right, this creates complications today, because what the court has become is something very different than what the court was originally. So when we start looking at what the court is today, we say we want to put our opinions, our expectations, our partisan narratives on the court. And we want the court to mitigate and join the fight, which is really a partisan battle. Just like everything we've talked about in class so far, the partisan infighting, the partisan struggle, the partisan battle, and the perversion of these powers has not made us stronger, that has not given us more integrity, but has actually guaranteed continual fighting, a loss of integrity. And nowhere is this more obvious, in my humble estimation, than what is happening on the court, where we have the majority of the court today is nothing more or less than partisan individuals selected for partisan reasons, and they vote on partisan lines. The court should be above politics. Of all the branches, the court overwhelmingly should be beyond the pressure and temptation and perversion of party allegiance. And we will not see a remedy to the United States government until we, the people, correct the institution that is the court. So what can we do, right? In my humble estimation, right, if we went to a simple 2/3 majority, that would do it. Require that the two parties affirm Supreme Court justice by 3/4. 4/5. Require 80 senators sign off. There are ways, easy ways to do this so we could correct the integrity of the Supreme Court. But we have to start thinking about the court differently. We have to see them as resolvers of conflict and not agents of conflict, right? This is big. But nonetheless, I am going to leave it there today. I threw a lot of information at you on the design and intention of the court. Maybe another lecture this week. I don't know. I'm going to have to see how this one goes because I threw a lot of information at you. Make sure you're getting your work done. Message me if anything comes up. Otherwise, I bid you all adieu, and I wish you the best.